In this section, we've been talking about diversity of life and leading into how do we classify life. And we'll get much more into classification in the next section when we explore the 6 main kingdoms of life. But one of the struggles that we run into is as we get new evolutionary revelations. So what does that mean? What is a new evolutionary revelation? The main thing is biochemical evidence. When we go back to the unit on evolution and we look at what was the most objective form of evidence for evolution, meaning I don't have to interpret it, it's just the same or it's different, that was DNA and amino acid sequences. And so as we collect more and more DNA and amino acid sequences, and as we compare those DNA and amino acid sequences, we start to realize that the original or historical classification system, which was based on anatomy, can actually be misleading. So sometimes our historical classification and our new evolutionary revelations are in opposites to each other. One of the main reasons to change classification structures is going to be the misleading anatomy. So when we look at this diagram over here and we look at these 3 animals, sometimes we would think that they have a lot in common. But if we look at the actual evolution, we'll see that sometimes the evolution really doesn't match up with the anatomy. And that has to do with analogous structures. Remember, homologous structures means the structure is the same in shape origin, meaning that the code was the same, meaning that they had a common ancestor. So homologous structures, like a bird wing and a bat wing, have more in common with each other than analogous structures, such as a bird wing and an insect wing. And so historically, evolution really looked at anatomy and the structures we could see physically. And that was sometimes misleading because of analogous structures, which are the result of, as this diagram reminds us, convergent evolution. So there are times where we need to actually change our classification based on our evolutionary relationships that we see. Now, how do we start to see these evolutionary relationships? Phylogeny is the study of evolutionary relationships. Now, for a long time, until possibly within the past 10 years, even phylogenetic trees were based on physical or behavioral characteristics. So if we look at this data chart on the left, they've given us 7 organisms, and we're looking at 6 different characteristics. These characteristics are still all anatomy-based. The best phylogenetic trees are going to be based on DNA or amino acid sequence similarities or differences. But we can still create phylogenetic trees based on physical characteristics, just keeping in mind that they could be misleading. However, given a data table like this, a 1 meaning that you have it, a 0 meaning that you don't, we're always going to have, usually phylogenetic trees are grounded in an outgroup. Outgroup is going to be an organism that we know does not have any of those characteristics. And then we start to look at what characteristics they do have. And so this is where we do need to be a little careful, and we do need to understand evolution before even creating one of these phylogenetic trees. Because when we look at, for example, this trait here, no tail, well, all of the other traits are has jaws, has lungs, has an amniotic membrane, has hair, is bipedal, but this no tail. And that would have been already established as being a trait that's lost. Right? So we've talked about like negative impact on fitness and losing structures. If this were turned around and said has tail, these five would have it and these two wouldn't. And it would kind of change the way the tree looks. And it would change the way we look at the tree. So anytime you're looking at characteristics, you do have to be very careful to examine different ways to look at it. Did they lose it? Possibly. So this is where we are very careful about ancestral versus derived characteristics. A derived characteristic is going to be a characteristic that is mutation-based and has arisen after MRCA, most recent common ancestor. Ancestral traits are what you share with your ancestor. So if we look at this diagram, shark, salamander, lizard, tiger, gorilla, human all have the ancestral trait of jaws. But the human has the derived characteristic of being bipedal. And so our job now is to create a phylogenetic tree that is based on this data. You'll notice that all of the lines end at about the same place. This represents they are all still extant. We can have organisms not branch all the way. And this would be an organism that is extinct. So if we had another organism on here that had become extinct, their branch wouldn't make it to kind of current day. You'll also notice that the traits are filled in, and this is almost like a roadmap. If I start here and I drive up, the lamprey diverges before the derivation of jaws. The shark diverges before the derivation of lungs, but has the ancestral trait of jaws with all the rest. So we want to be able to use these two terms, ancestral and derived. The outgroup we've already mentioned is the one that does not have any of the characteristics that we're examining. Any of the characteristics examined. And they're really there kind of as a comparison. And so what I've given you is another little table to try. I gave you some really challenging ones to try as well. But the key thing we need to pay attention to here is that for has a tail, yes is 0 and no is 1. Now you can kind of notice this trend with what's colored in where, and that can definitely help you color code your chart. We're going to come back to symplesiomorphes in class tomorrow, but I do want to end with how do you interpret a phylogenetic tree? And there are 3 terms that we have to kind of interpret phylogenetic trees. We have what are called monophyletic trees. One phylogeny. Para is the next one. Paraphyletic and polyphyletic. So like paraplegic means some or multiple, but poly means many. And what this has to do with how many differences are there within that group. But the key is really this picture. The yellow represents a monophyletic clade or part of the tree. And so monophyletic is going to mean that they all have all the traits in common. There are no unexplained traits. And so sometimes we talk about nesting, and so we can see like how they would be nested inside. A paraphyletic tree means there are some unexplained traits. So if I wanted to group these three organisms together and exclude aves, that would be a paraphyletic tree, because I have something that's unexplained here. A polyphyletic tree is going to be multiple extreme differences. So when we get to the protist kingdom, and we'll go ahead and put it here, when we get to the protist kingdom, if we don't really want to group them together as one kingdom, well, we've got plant-like protists, animal-like protists, fungi-like protists. We can't create a phylogenetic tree that shows their relationship. It's very polyphyletic, meaning, well, we've named them these, and these are in common, and we've named those, but we can't really explain how we got from here to there. So the main key to take away from phylogenetic trees is that really we want to be able to see the characteristics and identify which organisms are most closely related. The closer on the tree, the more closely related. And we want to be able to identify if the groupings on a tree are really acceptable. Can I accept that tree? And the desired is a monophyletic tree. So we are going to kind of stop there. Please make sure that you've looked at all the resources I've given you about phylogenetic trees, and tomorrow we'll talk about symplesiomorphies and plesiomorphies. So a short set of notes for today.